question in front of the board today, if you wish to call it that, at the Independent Republican, Mike Graham, is should we have a situation where David Carrick, who is a former serving police officer, only fired from his job yesterday, by the way, who has pleaded guilty to a whole series of terrible and ghastly sexual offences, including rape, including sexual assault, including false imprisonment, including torture, over a period of about 20 years within the Metropolitan Police. The question is, should he, and I raised this yesterday and it's now been picked up by every other newspaper in the land, including the Daily Mail, who put it on their front page, should he be able to be in receipt of a public sector pension? £22,000 is what they're calling it on the front page of the Daily Mail. I presume that's £22,000 a year. Let's talk now to Chris Daw, who's a barrister, of course. KC now, rather than QC, because we have a king rather than a queen. Chris, a very good morning to you.
Good morning. Now,
I'm assuming that you might not be in favour of taking this man's pension away on the basis that, in terms of the fairness of a society that we live in, it might be the wrong precedent to set. But I'm not sure what the law is on this. I'm not sure whether there is precedent for it.
Well, that's presumably why you've got me on. The answer
well, it's one of the reasons. The other reason is I quite like arguing with you.
I know. Well, you might not have that opportunity today because the way that the law works is that where a police officer commits a crime on duty, there are provisions for him to be, or her to be, stripped of their pension. And clearly this is a case where he abused his position as a police officer to commit the most appalling crimes. And I have absolutely no doubt that moves will be afoot to strip him of his pension. However, I kind of look at this from a slightly different angle, because who should get the money? And the money from his pension, so the way that police pensions work is some of the money is contributed by the officer in the way that many of us contribute to our pensions every month, our payroll, and some of it is contributed by the employer, which again happens in many walks of life. And so some of it is kind of money that's been accrued as a result of someone basically saving money, and the other is a contribution based on their job. Now, for me, this man has pleaded guilty to committing the most appalling crimes against dozens and dozens of people. And the short answer to this problem, I think, is a very easy one. The victims should get every single penny of that pension pot. He should not get a penny. I mean, he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison anyway. He's never going to be released. I'm pretty confident of that. Are you
sure? I mean, I don't know of anyone, really, in this day and age that spends their entire life in prison.
Well, there have been numerous examples. The Lee Rigby killer. I mean, whole life sentences have become much more common in the last year or two, but only for murder, it has to be said. However, in a case of this kind, a police officer abusing his position to commit such appalling sexual crimes, I would be amazed if he ever sees the light of day again. He's certainly going to get multiple life sentences. He's going to have a minimum sentence way into probably 30 or even 40 years before he can even apply for parole. So the chances of him ever seeing the light of day, I think, are very, very small. But I think this issue is really being looked at in the wrong way. You've had a lot of politicians who are sort of rattling sabres about it's all to do with the police, the system is wrong, and bent police officers and everything else. The truth for me is much more straightforward. He's committed these crimes. The victims deserve compensation as much as every possible penny they can get, and every single penny of his pension should be stripped from him by due process of law. I'm not suggesting we should have some system where everything's just done randomly. There has to be a process, an application. But in the end, the victim should get the money and the criminal should lose all of that pension, whether he accrued that pension as a result of his own contributions or not.
So is there legal precedent then to take the pension, first of all? Has that been done before, and will it happen?
Yes, it has, and I'm almost certain it will happen. The rules are very clear that if someone commits a crime when they're on duty, as he did, using his position as a police officer to commit crimes like rape, there is a very clear and well-established procedure to strip them of their police pension. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, and it has happened, and there are rules that allow it. And equally, of course, there are powers in both the Crown Court, where he's going to be sentenced, and through civil process, whereby victims can apply for compensation from an offender. And in this case, every penny of that pension should be going to those victims. I mean, it doesn't change the appalling things that happen to them, but it's much better that they have the compensation. My concern is that actually some of the commentary around this has suggested effectively that he should just forfeit his pension. Well, that just means it goes to it goes to the government.
Yeah,
now,
well, true.
We don't want this money to go to the government, do we? We want this money to go to the people he committed the crimes against.
Well, very possibly. We'll come back to that in a minute. So should we assume then that Wayne Couzens has had his pension stopped?
Listen, I can't tell you. I don't know. The answer is almost certainly either yes already, or there's a process in train for that to happen. But I don't know from that individual case.
This is why I'm interested. The reason I ask is because I don't remember this row going on around Wayne Couzens. Maybe it was because there were too many other issues to talk about. But here's a question for you. If you were to give the money to the victims of these crimes, how would you do that? Because, of course, you know, some people have had worse things done to them than others. You know, you've got a list of women here, some of whom were sexually assaulted, some of whom were locked up in a basement, some of whom were abused over a period of time, some of whom were imprisoned, some of whom were raped. You know, you'd have to... Unfortunately, you couldn't give them all the same amount, could you?
No, and it doesn't work. You're absolutely right. And of course, this is not a new legal situation. There are many offenders who commit crimes of varying severity against different victims, where they have money, and in many cases, offenders don't have any money, so this is almost academic. But where there is money, and this pension pot hypothetically may be worth several £100,000 in total when you look at the pot that's supposed to pay him out over the rest of his life, we could be talking about 300, 400, 500,000 in value of that pension pot. What you do is you take that amount, that value of that pot, and a judge has to assess how much each victim should get as a proportion. And judges are used to doing that. That happens every day in courts. You know, and you're absolutely right to point out that someone who suffers much more from a crime is entitled to more compensation. I should say there is also a criminal injuries compensation process whereby victims of all crimes can apply for compensation from the government, from taxpayers' money. But where you have an offender who has a pot of cash, they should be stripped of that cash and it should be given to the victims in a fair and proportionate way.
And what about his own contribution to his pension? Does he not have a right as an individual, regardless of the fact that he's a criminal, that he should at least get the money that he's put into his own pension back?
He does have a right to do that, but that's set against the right of a victim to be compensated for a crime. So that could, yes, in theory, he's got the right to that pension money, but undoubtedly that element or that part of his pension pot will be nowhere near enough to pay compensation to the victims. So it'll all be wiped out by compensation, or at least in my view, it should be.
Your reputation obviously precedes you. Somebody's asking here, would Chris represent this guy if he wanted to fight to keep his pension?
The answer is yes. Because, you know, frankly, I'll probably be conflicted from doing so, having given this interview, but and having expressed the views that I have. But the answer is I represent police officers all the time, some of whom are accused of serious misconduct. I also present cases against police officers who have committed sexual offences and other serious crimes. So as a lawyer, setting aside from my job of coming on your programme, usually arguing with you, but not today, it seems, I represent those who come to me for advice and representation, and ultimately the system decides what happens to my clients, and if this were someone I represented, I would do my best to represent his legal interests, but frankly I don't see that he has much opportunity to keep a single penny of his assets. They'll all be stripped away one way or the other by due process of law.
Well, let's hope so. Chris, good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Chris Daw KC, who we normally have a right old barney with, but actually being quite reasonable today. He thinks the pension should be removed, as do I. I can't imagine anybody who doesn't think that. But if you are one of those people, by all means do let us know. Coming next, though, it's time for Prime Minister's Questions.